Tsutomu Miyazaki was born prematurely on August 21st, 1962, weighing just 4.8 pounds and suffering from a birth defect. The condition caused the joints in his hands to be fused together, so he couldn't bend his wrists upwards. It's important to note here that a black and white photograph that is often said to be Tsutomu's hands has been debunked. It's an image taken from a medical textbook and displays the hands of someone with a condition named Marfan syndrome, which is a genetic disorder that affects connectivity tissue in the body. Tsutomu was the eldest son of a wealthy family. His granddad and great-granddad both served on the town council, and his parents were often busy, leaving him in the care of his granddad, Shokichi, and a nanny who was an intellectually disabled man. Tsutomu's father, Katsumi, was generally described as a workaholic, a well-regarded and well-known member of the community. Katsumi operated a regional newspaper named Akikawa Shimbun, and as a result, the family had great political influence in their hometown of Itsukaichi, Tokyo. Katsumi was reportedly more interested in collecting political video clips and the latest camera equipment than his own son, however, making him a rather absent father in Tsutomu's formative years. His mother, Raiko, wasn't much different. A busy working woman, she attempted to create a bond with his son by constantly buying him gifts, like his black Nissan Langley, and later she supplied him with his favourite comic books. Tsutomu didn't fare much better with the remainder of his family, nor his peers while growing up. His two young sisters, Setsuko and Haruko, reportedly found him repulsive and creepy, and while at school he was mocked and bullied for his deformed hands, which he was known to hide in photographs. As a result of his social isolation, Tsutomu kept to himself and did not experience a lot of things we usually do growing up, such as making friends and going on dates. Former classmates and teachers barely remember him when his crimes later came to light, but recalled that he was a quiet loner who struggled to form relationships. With so much free time on his hands, young Tsutomu became an excellent student. He was the first in his junior high school to pass the entrance exam to Maide Nakomo High School, a prestigious high school associated with Meiji University in Tokyo. For 3 years, he made the 2-hour commute each way every day to attend school, but eventually he began losing interest with his studies when his attention was grabbed by various forms of media, comic books, manga, and films. Instead of doing his homework, Tsutomu began to read his comic books until the early hours of the morning and even began to create his own. Some sources state that it was here he began drawing and writing about Ratman, his alter ego, who is described as an eyeless humanoid with a rat's head. By the time it came to his university entrance exam, Tsutomu was falling far behind in class. He ranked 40 out of 56 in his class, and as a result didn't receive the expected admission into university. While he'd originally planned to study English and become a teacher, he instead went to a local junior college and studied to become a photo technician. He blamed his failure to get into university on his hands. Around his late teens, Tsutomu began to notice his high sex drive, but he avoided women his own age, even as he entered his 20s, because he was said to be physically immature. While attending college, Tsutomu would visit the tennis courts and take both a picture camera and a video camera, and would photograph and film upskirt shots of the female players, which he would later masturbate to. It wasn't long before his comic books and manga were swapped out for pornography magazines, but he quickly grew tired of them, claiming they blocked out the most important part. By 1984, he had turned to child pornography instead. Dr. Sasumi Oda, a criminal psychiatrist who worked at Tsukuba University, said that because Tsutomu had made no friends and had never garnered any knowledge of sex in the real world, he turned to videos, comics, and pornography for his thrills. Tsutomu graduated in the spring of 1983, aged 21. From here he went on to work at a printing plant that was owned by an acquaintance of his father. For 3 years he saved the equivalent of around £19,000 or $26,000 before he moved back into his family home, where he shared a 2-bedroom annex with his older sister. At this point, the 24-year-old expressed no desire to take over his father's business, which caused some bitterness and upset in the family. Later, when reflecting on his upbringing, Tsutomu said that he craved being listened to about his problems, but that he believed his parents would not have heard him and he would have been ignored. He He also stated, if I tried to talk to my parents about my problems, they just brushed me off. I even thought about suicide. Tsutomu's depression only worsened when in May of 1988, his grandfather passed away. The loss of his only real human connection, and of the only person who seemed to listen and genuinely care for him, is what is believed to have triggered Tsutomu's subsequent murder spree that spanned a year. Later at his trial, a witness for the defense claimed that the 25-year-old had wanted to reincarnate his grandfather, and believed that his reincarnation would not be complete if any of his grandfather's body remained. It was this belief that caused Tsutomu to eat some of his grandfather's cremated ashes following his death. In the ensuing weeks, Tsutomu's behaviour changed for the worst, as he became more aggressive and more overt about his sexual nature. One of his younger sisters caught him watching her while she bathed. She called him out and told him to leave, but Tsutomu, in retaliation, attacked her by bashing her head against the bathtub. When his mother later heard about this, she demanded that her son spent more time working and less time with his videotapes. Again, in response, the 25-year-old lashed out and attacked his mother. His father had given up talking to him about his behaviour by this point. At around 3 p.m. on August 22nd, 1988, just one day after Tsutomu's 26th birthday, 4-year-old Mari Kono left her house in Irma, Saitama, about an hour from Tokyo. She intended on visiting a friend to play, but by 6:23 p.m. she hadn't returned home, and her panicked parents began looking for her. When they found no signs of Mari, they reported her disappearance to the police. Meanwhile, Tsutomu had offered Mari a lift, which she accepted. She was content to play with the buttons on his radio as he drove the pair in his Nissan Langley down National Highway No. 16 towards Haichiyo in western Tokyo. An hour and a half after leaving Irma, Tsutomu parked the car on a narrow dirt road near the Shintama power station. The pair walked to the nearby hiking trail, and after 20 to 30 minutes they sat down, just 20 meters from the main path. At this point, however, Mari was beginning to get upset, afraid that she'd start screaming, or afraid that if he took her home she'd tell her parents. Tsutomu decided to kill the 4-year-old by strangling her. After her demise, he sexually abused her corpse before fleeing the area, her clothing still in his possession. Tsutomu later returned to the crime scene and removed her hands and feet, which he kept in his closet for some time following the murder. He later burned her remaining bones in his furnace. While the police began to search for the missing 4-year-old, her body lay in the dark woods 31 miles from home. Although her case publicly remained a missing persons inquiry in the following months, privately the police believed they were looking for a killer. Law enforcement sent 50,000 posters featuring her photograph to other police stations, as well as train, bus and subway stations. Additionally, they interviewed dozens of people around her home, and even brought in scent dogs, although the canines failed to track Mari's scent. The only lead investigators had were 3 witnesses. 2 young boys believed they saw the 4-year-old walking behind a man, heading towards the nearby Irma River. Meanwhile, a 38-year-old housewife told authorities that she'd seen a girl matching Mari's description, with a man she didn't recognize. She described him as being in his late 30s, around 5'5" or 5'6", with a round, pudgy face and dark curly hair. He also wore white trousers and a white sweater, although neither of these sightings was ever confirmed as being Tsutomu or Mari. The description of the man lines up with Tsutomu's image, except for the age difference, as Tsutomu was 26 at the time. A few days after Mari vanished, her mother, Yuki, received a postcard that read, "The devils are about." However, the police dismissed the postcard as a prank and failed to look further into it. Then a month later, the search for the missing child began to dwindle. Investigators had no body, and there had been no ransom demand, so they were struggling to find new leads and clues. 6 weeks later, on October the 3rd, Tsutomu abducted 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa after spotting her as she walked along a rural road. He offered her a lift, which she accepted, before driving her to the same hiking trail that he had taken Mari Kono to. Tsutomu quickly developed an MO, like Mari. He strangled Masami before stripping her body and sexually abusing her corpse. He then abandoned her in the forest and fled with her clothing. Her body was less than 100 meters from where Mari had been dumped. Later that night, Masami's parents reported her missing, and a search was quickly launched as police and loved ones looked desperately for the 7-year-old, but they were unable to find her. Flyers featuring her image were posted, and interviews were conducted by law enforcement, who noted that Mari's home was just 8 miles from Masami's. However, at this time they did not concretely make the connection between the two cases, and once more, investigators struggled with no body, no ransom demand, and no leads. 2 months later, on December 12, 1988, Tsutomu abducted 4-year-old Erika Namba as she walked home from her friend's house. He forced her into his car and drove the young girl to a car park in Naguri. Here he demanded that she remove her clothing while she sat in the back seat, and he began taking photos of her, although she was distressed and crying. As he continued to photograph Erika's body, headlights swept across Tsutomu's car and shone on his face for a brief moment. This served to further upset the 4-year-old, and eventually he climbed into the back seat and strangled her to death. Afterwards, he tied her hands and feet behind her back, wrapped her body in a bedsheet, and placed her in the trunk of his car. On his way to dispose of the body, however, one of Tsutomu's tires became stuck after it slipped into a gutter. Knowing it was risky to call for help or flag someone down while he still had a body in his trunk, the 26-year-old left his hazard lights on and took Erika's corpse before heading off into the dark woods nearby. He disposed of her clothing too. When he returned to the car, Tsutomu was surprised to find 2 men standing at his vehicle. They offered to help him get his wheel out of the ditch, so the 26-year-old agreed, quietly placing the bedsheet back into his trunk. The men didn't notice or didn't question why he had the sheet and helped him move his vehicle. There are mixed reports about when Erika's body was found. Some sources claim it was found the following day, while others state that 3 days passed before it was discovered. What is known is that she was roughly 31 miles or an hour and 45 minutes away from home. The 2 men who'd helped Tsutomu with his car on the evening of October 3rd went to the police with their information after they heard about the finding of Erika Namba's body. While they correctly told law enforcement that the vehicle had Chio plates, they failed to correctly identify the make and model of his car. They believed he drove a Toyota Corolla 2, not a Nissan Langley. As a result, authorities wasted countless hours and resources investigating 6,000 Toyota Corolla 2s. Following the discovery of Erika's body, police finally made the connection between the missing girls and realized that there was a serial killer on the loose. This information shocked the general public, as the Saitama prefecture had very few crimes against children. Each of the girls lived within 18 miles of one another, and that was the only thing they had in common. Each of the families had been receiving odd phone calls since the children had gone missing. If the families answered the calls, they'd be met only with an eerie silence, but if they avoided answering, the phone would ring for up to 20 minutes. Not even a week had passed before Tsutomu decided to taunt the bereaved family of Erika Namba by sending them a postcard that read, "Erika, cold, cough, throat, rest, die." The note had been put together using letters cut out of magazines, although the perpetrator of the little girl murders, as they were dubbed by the Japanese press, didn't kill again for some time. Tsutomu was still busy hurting the loved ones of the girls whose lives he'd already stolen. On February 6, 1989, Marie Kono's parents found a box on their doorstep. It contained ashes and charred bones, along with 10 small teeth, photos of the clothing Mari was last seen in, and a postcard. The note this time read, "Mari, cremated, bones, investigate, prove." Like the previous postcard, it had been created with the use of magazine cutouts. Momentarily, there was some confusion over whether or not the teeth conclusively belonged to Mari. One expert concluded that they weren't hers before changing his mind, believing that he may be mistaken, although he did not elaborate further. Meanwhile, a separate forensic specialist determined that the bone fragments were definitely Mari's. This information shattered the hearts of most of the 4-year-old's family, who would believe that Mari was still alive. Her mother, however, continued to believe, despite the information she was given by experts. Then, using the pseudonym Yuko Imada, which roughly translates to "Now I'll Tell," Tsutomu penned a 3-page letter titled Crime Confession. Part of the letter read, "I put the cardboard box with Mari's remains in it in front of her home. I did everything, from the start of the Mari incident to the finish. I saw the police press conference where they said the remains were not Mari's. On camera, her mother said the report gave her new hope that Mari might still be alive. I know then that I had to write this confession so Mari's mother would not continue to hope in vain. I say again, the remains are Mari's. Frustratingly, this letter was able to provide the police with clues. Although it does not appear that investigators acted on them. The Polaroid of Mari's clothing was taken with a Mamiya 6x7 camera like those used by printers. Additionally, the postcard's typeface was established as being from a photo typesetter and copied onto an industrial copier. Neither the camera nor the copier was available for the general public to use in 1988 or 1989, and it's unclear if this lead was correctly followed, as police officers declined to comment on whether or not they had begun to investigate local printers at the time. Shortly after this, Tsutomu sent another letter to Mari's family. He used the same alias and described in great detail the deterioration of their daughter's body, parts of it gruesomely red. After a while, the body is covered with stretch marks. It was so rigid before, but now it feels like it's full of water. How it smells. Like nothing you've ever smelled in this whole wide world. By the summer of 1989, Tsutomu's well-being was in decline as he began to isolate himself all the more, skipping out on work to stay home and edit his videotapes. On June 6th, he planned to visit the tennis courts, but they were closed. However, in a nearby park, he found 5-year-old Ayako Nomoto playing alone. He convinced her to allow him to take photos of her, and when she became more comfortable with him, he lured her into his car, where he strangled her, covered her corpse with a bedsheet, and placed her in his trunk. Reportedly, the 26-year-old became enraged when Ayako commented on his deformed hands, which is what led him to kill her. This time, instead of abusing her corpse and dumping it, however, Tsutomu brought her home, where he spent the next 2 days taking photos and videos of it in various positions, while he again sexually abused it. When the body began to decompose, he knew he had to get rid of it. He dismembered Ayoko's corpse and discarded her torso near a public toilet in Hano's Miyazawako Cemetery before abandoning the rest of her in the hills of Mitekeyama. He then kept her hands, drinking blood from them and cannibalizing them. 5 days later, Ayoko's torso was found and quickly identified, using a combination of chest size, blood type, and stomach contents. On July 23, 1989, Tsutomu saw 2 sisters playing in a park in Hakioji. He managed to separate the siblings by telling the older sister to stay put, while he went to a more secluded area with the younger child. However, the older sibling did not do what he wanted. Instead, she ran home to tell her father about the strange man who had gone off with his sister. Tsutomu coerced and forced the younger girl into taking off her clothes and began taking photos of her. In the middle of this, however, he was caught by the children's father, who attacked the 26-year-old but was unable to restrain him. Tsutomu took off running from the scene on foot, but he eventually, foolishly on his part, returned to the scene for his car, where police were waiting for him, and was arrested on the spot. The 26-year-old remained silent for his first 2 weeks in police custody. However, it wasn't long before authorities began searching his home, and the press then caught wind of the contents of it. A search of his 2-bedroom home turned up 5,763 videotapes. Some featured anime, hentai, and slasher films, while others contained both adult and child pornography, as well as footage of his victims. Investigators did not expect that such a quiet, mild-mannered man would possess such horrific materials. His pornography videos were described as extreme. It was only after this collection was found that Tsutomu decided to confess to his crimes. He initially confessed to the murder of Ayako Nomoto, whose skull was found around mid-August. On September 6th, Masami's remains were discovered in the forest near Komi Pass, and Mari's hands and feet were found a week later. While Tsutomu was in custody, and later during his trial, he kept a perpetually calm and composed demeanor. The Japanese media labeled him the Otaku murderer, after they heard about the materials found in his home. Otaku is a Japanese term that is often used in a derogatory manner, and refers to someone who is obsessed with manga and anime to the point of detachment from reality. Fans of these art forms, however, have pushed back against this name for Tsutomu, noting that there is no basis for the claim that manga and/or anime turned him into a murderer. He was, however, believed to have been removed from reality, with Dr. Susumu Oda stating that his obsession with books, comics and films removed his consciousness from reality. Everything became an item to him, including people. The little girls he killed were no more than characters from his comic book life. A psychoanalyst named Kaigo Okanogi at Tokyo International University said that he believed Tsutomu had retreated into a fantasy world of manga because of his neglected upbringing. He told the Shuken Post the danger of a whole generation of youth who do not even experience the most primary 2- or 3-way relationship between themselves and their mother and father, and who cannot make the transition from a fantasy world of videos and manga to reality, is now extreme. There have, however, been critics of those who blame media consumption for Tsutomu's crimes. Some believe that the 26-year-old's pornography collection was added to or amended to highlight his crimes, while another felt that the notion that manga played a part in the murders was designed to play into the public's fears about otaku, and that by doing this it would help authorities secure a conviction in the case. Furthermore, these forms of media, particularly anime and manga, were very popular with the younger generations at the time, especially in Tokyo, but few of these young people have gone on to become serial killers. While in custody and later during his trial, Tsutomu made it clear that he held very little regard for human life. He told investigators that he had killed numerous cats before he began to carry out his crimes, claiming that he threw one in the river and did another in with boiling water. He also confessed to strangling his own dog with a strand of wire. Tsutomu's father refused to pay for his legal defense. As a result, it took some time for the public defender's office to find lawyers willing to take the case. One of the 2 men who agreed did so because he opposed the death penalty. The defense team aimed to prove that Tsutomu had dismissed responsibility due to mental health issues, and the idea that he couldn't tell right from wrong, but the state of his mental well-being was something of a bone of contention at the time. The trial began on March 30th, 1990. Throughout it, the 26-year-old was known to talk nonsense, and he blamed his actions on his alter ego Ratman, who promised to bring his grandfather back to life if he abducted and killed children. He even spent considerable time drawing Ratman in cartoon form for the court. The trial spanned over 7 years, and focused heavily on Tsutomu's mental state at the time of the murders, as under Japanese law, people of unsound minds are not subject to punishment. 3 teams of court-appointed psychiatrists came to different conclusions about his ability to tell right from wrong, however, which threw a spanner in the works for his defense team. 2 teams determined that he was feeble-minded, but even they came to separate opinions about what exactly his disorder was. One team believed he was schizophrenic, while another believed he had multiple personality disorder. The 3rd team, who believed he was capable of taking accountability for his actions, found that he had a personality disorder, but it's unclear if they specified further. The Tokyo District Court agreed with the 3rd team, believing that Tsutomu was aware of the consequences of his actions and the gravity of them, and decided that therefore he should be held accountable. Tsutomu was sentenced to death on April 14, 1997. This decision was upheld by both the Tokyo High Court in June 2001 and the Supreme Court of Justice in January of 2006. During the trial, he called his crimes an act of benevolence and refused to apologize for his actions. Tsutomu never believed he had done anything wrong and claimed he'd done a good job. During his time in prison, he exchanged over 300 letters with Hiroyuki Shinoda, the editor of a monthly magazine. Shinoda said Tsutomu wrote to him twice a month, and he often wrote about his recent situation, detailing his meals and daily activities, rarely discussing his crimes. He appeared to think that his execution was a long way off, and upon hearing that his date of death had been confirmed, he wrote, "This is silly. That judge will be sorry. He must be an idiot." One of the few comments he made about the murders while writing his letters to Shinoda was, "There's nothing much to say about them. I'm happy. I think I did a good deed." He also stated, "I think I'll be acquitted. I don't intend to apologize to the bereaved families." It was also noted that during Tsutomu's trial, he was more concerned about his videotapes and his car than he was about his crimes and own potential death sentence. In another letter to Shinoda dated from 2007, he demanded that Japan change their capital punishment method, writing, "Under the current execution method, 2 death row inmates have to suffer great fear at the time of their execution, and therefore won't have a chance to feel regret for what they've done. For this reason, we should switch to lethal injections of the kind used in the United States." Of this letter and Tsutomu's looming execution, Shinoda said, "He never wrote anything that indicated he was scared of the execution. He behaved as if it was something that was going to happen to someone else. After his death sentence was finalized, he regularly complained of hearing things, but I never really figured out what was going on in his mind." After his imprisonment, Tsutomu's parents shut down their business and went into hiding. His father made a public statement apologizing for his son's actions shortly before closing the newspaper, and Tsutomu wrote him a letter that was furious in its tone, in which he blamed his father for everything. His mother, meanwhile, continued to bring him comic books while he was in jail. Tsutomu showed her a small amount of compassion, writing to her, "Mother, I've caused you so much heartache." He later added, "Don't forget to change the oil in my car, or it'll get so that you can't drive it." In 1994, Tsutomu Miyazaki took his own life by throwing himself into a river. The Minister of Justice, Kuno Hatayama, signed Tsutomu's death warrant on June 17, 2008. He was hanged that same day, aged 45, at the Tokyo detention house. His hanging caused some controversy at the time, however, as just 1 month earlier, Tsutomu and his defense team had requested a retrial. In the 10 years before his execution, inmates waited an average of around 8 years between when their date of execution was finalized and when they died. They'd spend longer waiting if they appealed. Tsutomu, however, spent only 2 years and 4 months waiting. In the case of a retrial, one's execution would not normally occur so quickly, but in this specific case, the Justice Ministry pushed on with it, instead of exercising caution. Outside of the murders themselves, one of the grimmest facets of this case is that Tsutomu seemed to inspire other like-minded individuals. Kaoru Kobayashi was a known paedophile who was convicted of sexually assaulting 8 children in 1989 when he was 21 years old. However, he received only a suspended sentence of 2 years in prison for his horrific crimes. In October 1991, he then attempted to murder a 5-year-old girl. He served 3 years in prison and was paroled in November of 1995, before being released just 8 months later in July of 1996. From this point, he began working as a newspaper delivery man. On November 17, 2004, he kidnapped 7-year-old Kaide Ariyama while she made the journey home from school. Using the 7-year-old's own phone, Kobayashi took a photograph of Kaide and sent it to her mother with the caption, "I've got your daughter." He then killed her and dumped her body in a gutter in the town of Haguri, where it was found later that night. Investigators discovered that she'd been drowned, likely in a bath or sink, as the water was clean. She'd been undressed and redressed, and was missing several of her teeth. She also had abrasions to her hands and feet, which were believed to have been made post-mortem. After her demise, Kobayashi continued to hold on to Kaide's mobile phone. On December 14th, he used it to send her mother an email saying, "I'll take her baby sister next." These taunting messages, however, are what ultimately led to his arrest. He was sentenced to death for kidnapping. At his 2008 trial, he said, "I want to be sentenced to death as quickly as possible, and leave a legacy among the public as the next Tsutomu Miyazaki, or Mamoru Tokuma." The later of these names refers to a mass murderer who killed 8 children in the Osaka school massacre in Akita, Osaka Prefecture in 2001. Upon hearing about this statement from Kobayashi, Miyazaki stated, "I won't allow him to call himself the second Tsutomu Miyazaki when he hasn't even undergone a psychiatric examination." Although lesser known in the likes of the US and Europe, Tsutomu Miyazaki is one of the worst serial killers to ever emerge from Japan, and his evil legacy continues to torment the families of those whose loved ones he so callously killed between 1988 and 1989. Thank you for watching this episode of Murderous Minds. Our heart truly goes out to all of those affected by the terrible crimes of this evil person,